Bube. This is me, Sal Bay, aka Warlock Asylum, coming at you with another episode of the OG Den with Keenan Booker, aka the God 720. And today we're going to be talking about the history of the undead during the medieval era. So I did have a question for Keenan Booker. He has his book Kicked Out of Heaven. It's a 3-volume series. If you haven't picked it up, make sure you grab it. Got the book Frontline, Kicked Out of Heaven. And I'm going to share my screen a bit. I want to show an excerpt from his text, okay, that deals with the undead and the vampires. But today we're going to be talking about the undead. And we can see here that this is a grave from the Victorian age when the fear of zombies and vampires was prevalent. If you look at the graves, you can see how they were covered. There was a tombstone and the cage. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to let Keenan Booker explain what was behind that euphoria, that mania, that mortuary mania that was going on during the medieval era.
A mortuary mania. Those pictures that you just showed right there come from the Scotland kirkyards. That's Kirk, which is a root word to the word church. It is a metaphysic is one layer. The kirk was like an office it was an ecclesiastical office during that time. And I think only in Scotland, I don't know. And this also could have been Protestant thing, because there was a lot of religions there was a lot of theories or groups that supported certain philosophies that were, that rose and collapsed. And then when America was being built, it got solid. So that's where your Baptist, Presbyterian, and all of your Protestant and all of that stuff, right? So that comes from, old Europe and those groups who were going against the Catholic way. Catholicism has a very large history of violence that makes people shun it. And there's a lot of other elements as well, because there's a thin line between witchcraft and Catholicism. And there is no Catholicism without witchcraft, vice versa. And this goes into the incorruptible saints, or what we see on the Catholic side, which could be on the flip side of the same coin. We have the undead. You see that? Now, the undead or the incorruptible saints can be a mirror or an extension in time from the Egyptian mummy. You see that? Right. So when we're looking at the undead is connected to the plague. The pictures that you just saw, and the argument is that they don't know if these cages were specifically for bodies trying to come out or for grave robbers that were trying to go in, okay? And this is also the science of a mortuary, like the little building that is above the ground, right, to not let the body be affected by worms, this and that. There's a whole spiritual mathematical system that goes behind that, you see what I'm saying, on why they're doing that. But then when we look at it, there's definitely an asphyxiation with disinterment, and disinterment is taking the body out of the ground, you see. Now, the undead, and there are many, many documents. You have to understand that the majority and probably the most valid information pertaining to these subjects, and all the subjects dealing with what I've written in volume 1, 2, and 3, are still locked into ancient languages inside their courthouses in small villages and in major cities as well, all throughout Europe, okay? So there could be far more details than what I'm about to explain here. From my knowledge, the undead is directly linked to the events of plague. Now, one thing about the plague is that, and also lead poisoning, is that it would put one into a comatose state. So sometimes there were bodies that were found during the course of plague, or bodies that were found early in the morning from last night's drunkenness that was actually poisoned from lead poison. And lead poisoning will knock you out for 3-4 days. So they didn't, and this is where our system of the wake before the funeral comes from. You see, it was waiting for somebody to wake up. They put him inside the coffin box, and it was reported, just like some of these plague bodies that were in a comatose state but weren't really dead were put inside the coffin box, that when you go through the cemeteries, you would actually hear these bodies croaking out of the ground. You know, they said it sounded like hogs croaking, you know. And there's also some of these cases where you would hear scratching at the inside of the coffins. So they would pull the bodies out, and sometimes these bodies were extremely pale. Sometimes these bodies had red bloods that were still running through them, but they were in a dead pale state, you know. And there's a lot of different stories that build up a constitution of that compile the totality of an entity. You see what I'm saying? So
let me this one is or get some insight into this. So this was going on in the graveyards because at the time they didn't have a true mortuary science.
All right, and then that's one. And then sometimes there was cases where they had to dig the body back up for a murder case they were trying to solve, or they had to dig the body back up. They finally found the murderer, and they would make the murderer touch the body, and then where the wound was at, and if the blood would gush from the body at that wound. You see, if the blood would gush, then that means that they committed the crime. That was the murderer that did it. Okay, there was other tests that went on to see if a murderer was a murderer, but they were based off of a theological, spiritual principle, and these tests were repetitious throughout many different courts in many different countries. So it had to be a validity of what was going on. The reason why this whole little area is dark in history and time is because there's been a lot of information that has been destroyed through human intelligence, which leaves us at a blank state to ask ourselves if these were the real capabilities of the land that we live on, because nobody's educated enough to even produce or to comprehend the activity that was going on. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. Now, then before you go on, you got another question, but I had to explain this layer of the undead as well, and that would be a necromancer. Usually with a necromancer, a magician, or even a witch, they would put a brick inside the mouth, or they would put weights on the coffin, on the top of the coffin, or make sure the nail in the coffin statement that we use in the day last, you put the nail in the coffin, that comes from this scenario. You see what I'm saying? And right. And they were very serious about bracing a body when they put it in the ground that's probably why they started doing 6-foot graves, because at this time these graves were shallow. They were around like 2 feet. So these 6-foot graves that we utilize now, especially with the heavy coffin doors and the style of the coffins that we utilize, are also unconscious prevention of the fear of the arisal of the dead re-arising. Now, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, why were the witches putting bricks on top of the coffin? Was it just to keep the coffin, the contents within, or was it some sort of?
No, they were putting that on dead witches. On their coffin.
I see.
Right.
I see.
If there was like a witch that was known through the neighborhood and she didn't get sent to no stake or anything, in a small village type of scenario. The small villages had a lot of weird stories. There's a story of a witch who was buried and came back to life and turned into a big chicken and assaulted people all through the city and killed a couple of people. A lot of these stories have stories of deaths that actually occurred. So from these entities that re-arose from the dead. What they would say was reanimate. How they explained it was that a demon went inside the body and reanimated the body. So the body's right. So it wasn't that the body was an actual undead. It was alive because there was a devil entity inside the body. So, and that gave it the line of the supernatural capabilities. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Wow. I mean, I'm aware of it, from some of the studies that we do. And
Put the mic up, put the mic up.
yeah, I'm kind of aware of some of the stuff, but it's very interesting to see the practical history of the mortuary aspect of it. You know what I'm saying? Like a lot of times, witches and warlocks, I mean, the main objective is to become jinn possessed or um, to use the possession in a way that they can function, like to merge the body. So some people call it the sacred marriage, right? But in the craft, it's perceived their understanding of that would be to merge with something that was like a daemon or like a jinn or something like that, and to have that consciousness going on, so that that aspect of themselves, once the consciousness is merged, they can live on if the body's decayed in that form and then assume another body.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty intense stuff. You know what I'm saying? And like usually some of the shadow organizations will kind of cover that aspect of it, because I know it touches on the fringes of vampirism, which we'll discuss in another episode. But go ahead, continue, brother. Yeah, on the level of
Oh well, there's this, like the werewolf and like a blood sucking entity like the vampire, which the vampire isn't really found throughout a multitude of other cultures, but a blood sucking entity is, which is of an animal form usually, and it's usually of a bird or a bat, and that's what you'll find in I think there's one of those entities inside the Brazilian culture, one of the empires, ancient empires, Aztec in those areas, they have a similar story. But then when it comes to the undead, you find the undead as well, and the zombie for the voodoo. And this is a different case of slavery. Now, yeah, the zombie, which is also Zambia, you see the country Zambia and the word zombie, they're both connected. And they're created for a slavery purpose. Okay. And there's a ritualistic practice of drinking a concoction and burying the individual and all of this, which doesn't necessarily state that the person is dead, but the person is dead to the aspects of life because they are bound in the realms of slavery. When it comes to slavery or extortion inside of witchcraft, it's usually done by the witches. And witches would turn men into a cow, or turn a man into a donkey in order to carry out their workload on the farm. And the donkey or the cow, the bull, they would still have human consciousness, but they would be in the shape and of an animal and would be carrying out the demands of the witch. Okay, but they weren't in the state of the dead and being re-arose from the dead. Entities that re-arose from the dead in European witchcraft inflicted violence on people. Now, and that's not all the stories. All the stories are not based um, on infliction of pain. There's one story where a man dug himself back out of the grave, went home, and ate food with the family, and then left and went back to the grave. Okay, so and the family didn't say anything about it. They just allowed him to come and eat at the dinner table. I think I got that story inside the book. And then there's another story where the stake comes in, the stake that you see that was transferred off into the Dracula later on. That story actually comes from an individual that was buried, and when they discovered him, he was making noises in his casket. And then when they discovered him, they tried to put a stake in. When he moved from his casket, they put a stake in him. And then he took the stake out of him and he said, "Thank you for the stake." And he protected himself with the stake, and he abused some dogs, he beat some dogs, and I think he killed about a couple of people before he was found and killed again. And this is also where beheading comes from. And this is a a security measure for not allowing the undead to re-arise and amputating the body at death, or during the course of dying, for especially for criminals, you know. Yeah.
Some deep stuff. I mean, it touches on some points. I remember when I was a little boy, there was a guy who was a missionary that was a good friend of my father's. He was a missionary in, I would want to say South America, but where he was at, there was a lot of spiritualism, as he called it. And there was a situation where he discussed about zombies that he encountered where these were like living beings, living human beings that they were kind of near the point of death and they were given some type of concoction and they would do the bidding of whoever employed them. You know what I'm saying? Which is really, really interesting. But there is something I want to touch on before we go further because it's something that you said early on. In relationship to Catholicism and witchcraft, not to digress too much into that subject, but how would you say simply was a lot of the witches that lived in the medieval era, were they Catholic? Did they have ties with the
Um,
Catholic Church, or was they actually opposed to the church? And it was sort of like a war against them. I know the church, Catholic Church, did have
yeah, they're opposed
penalties.
from the church, and yeah, they're opposed of the church, and the opposition is really from the witchcraft point of view, it's charlatanism, because at the end of the day, Catholicism, like all religions, had to submit to the pagan way. They had to incorporate the pagan rituals and also the pagan gods into their entities in order to survive inside the new world or create whatever measure to make them join. So, because of this, and because of the status of where we're at right now, and because of the synthetic, you have to understand that paganism is, or what we want to call the witchcraft arts, are a representation of nature. And right now we live in a synthetic world. So we definitely find it as, a high level of disrespect. The ancient mythology systems find it as a high level of disrespect as well. Now, the syntheticism has allowed security, which is good. And these things are needed for man. But the disrespect that constitutes amongst men, and especially the layer that it's at right now, is unnecessary. A lot of the elements that has been embedded inside of our social structure can be altered and still maintain the system that we have, so we can thoroughly have a better picture on who we are as humans. Because there's a lot of stuff that we do not know about the mechanism of who we are and where we're at and what the capabilities are. The possibilities.
Yeah, that's pretty deep. And I guess um, I know I had did another series or working on another series. There's also another good book that I've read about the cult of the dead and ancestral worship, and it gets into ancient reverence for the deceased and stuff like that. So I guess it's one of man's fascinations besides sex. Um, and as he matures as a race, a lot of superstition, I'm sure, will probably erode, and some of the real aspects of what the superstition is based on should arise. So you know, it's kind of funny because in some ways, you know, witchcraft is based on natural science, and when you look at things like zombies and voodoo dolls and stuff like that, it's like it looks, very sinister, and it is in some ways. But in other ways, it's sort of like to actually create those things is, an individual trying to tap into artificial intelligence. You know what I'm saying? At some, you know, place and point, which is now being developed in a different way. So it's very, very, very interesting. Now, how did the governments of the time considered the undead? Did you come across any information in your studies that?
Oh, well, the stories that I have show very clearly that they had full-fledged courts during the 1400s with proper judgment and investigation. They had DAs, they had lawyers, they had judges, all of that, right. And that's phenomenal because, we weren't educated about anything of that nature. And from what we know right now, they didn't have those things at that time, but they definitely did. And the undead was sought and was, judged by the medical, the local doctors, the lawyer, the DA. It's all written like that inside the Divine too. It's very clear that there's a high possibility that this was real. Now, I wanted to go in on this too. The Frankenstein is a carryover, but I didn't want to talk about the Frankenstein. The Frankenstein is the Frankish Jew, if you understand the wordplay.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So that the Frankish is the French Jew, and then the flower, the lily that they use at the end, the fleur de lis, and then the killing of the girl, and the combination of the Frankenstein is definitely can be symbolized as all of Europe being combined, and they're now rulership over the planet as a monster. And this monster, Frankenstein, it has the romantic understanding of I only know how to murder from the disgust that the human has taught the Frankenstein, you see, because the Frankenstein was a creation that was blank in thought. So its experiences of being harassed throughout the movie. We're talking about the original black and white, throughout the movie, right, built up the disgust of beauty, you see, and the beauty was found in the little girl that he killed, and also in the flower that he held, which also shows a deep unconscious layer, the level of degeneracy that old Europe had been in, which hopefully had been killed and monstered at that time. You see what I'm saying? It had been controlled and embodied inside the Frankenstein character. And you can also see that in Igor from Notre Dame. I mean, well, Igor is in Frankenstein, but I'm talking about the Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Right, the Hunchback.
Right.
Yeah.
And the word Notre Dame means Black Madonna. If you understand it, Notre is Neuer, for then Dame is Madame. But I wanted to say this about the zombie character as it stems out of the undead, and the zombie is what we understand it today, which stems from the Caribbean. Now, the reason why we just went through 10 years of The Walking Dead, and as you understand, the vagabond walks, right? So this is The Walking Dead, right? He has no progression for life, you see. So you have to understand that the zombie is a symbol of being soulless. It also doesn't have a communication skill. It also doesn't have foresight on its next meal. The first thing that it has to grab, and the first thing that is alive, it attacks, because whatever is alive is not of its status as dead. So this is the highest level of courage, when you can be soulless, when you have no thought. You are at the highest level of courage, right? But this also brings us to the highest level of barbarism. And this is the mandate, the Neanderthal status for the demand of food. Okay. Now we can also is symbolizing in the toxicity of what we've done with ourselves, with our diet here across the world right now, with the synthetic foods that we're eating and all of that stuff. You see what I'm saying? And our meat, bread, cheese based diet, which would definitely leave us to a meat identification as a source for food when we're not using any foliage, and there's trees and greens everywhere around the zombies that we saw on the Walking Dead TV show, right? But they don't recognize that as a food source because it doesn't match with the acidic toxicity of their bodies. You see what I'm saying? So when it comes to the Walking Dead and its stem out from the zombie character and its stem out from the undead, it's violent in the standpoint of survival, because it's a mirror of the lower class, of the peasant class of society. Okay, which has no comprehension. And this is the bloodsucker that has no comprehension, which is a human status, as the Count Dracula has a comprehension because he has a skill to seduce women. You see,
Yeah.
but they're both the same coin because they're inhuman. You see, they're not an animal bloodsucker like the werewolf. You see.
Wow, that's heavy. Now, one question that did come up as I'm listening to this, because I know a lot of the research, the bulk of it studies medieval history of Europe. Did you come across any of, say, reactions to phenomena like zombie or the undead, let's say amongst like Islam or the Arabs? Did they have?
No, I haven't ran across that with Islam or the Arabs. Okay, no, because I had just recently read. I think I did. I just recently read a medical document written, an ancient medical document written by one of the top. I'm trying to think of his name right now. It's something with a Z in it, and we use the term all the time. But anyways, there was something in there about rising the dead, awakening the dead. As you see, Jesus was another character that rose from the dead.
Yeah.
So rising from the dead is also rising from the dead is also a sexual statement that women use, for erectile dysfunction. It's an erectile dysfunction statement that women use, and that's the comical side of it. You see, so I haven't ran into anything with Islam, but I did run across some Chinese. They have it. They have rising from the dead in the Chinese mythology system. I didn't detail what it was.
Yeah.
Right, I didn't detail what it was, but it is there.
Yeah. The Chinese definitely, because they, before like the advent of Buddhism or even Taoism, there was the folk religion in China of Shintoism, and in that they dealt a lot with ancestor worship, and from that science spun off Taoism, which they had to develop ways to limit interactions with the deceased, in their society. You know what I'm saying? So they were probably one of the surviving nations that pulled a lot from the solar current. You know what I mean? So they definitely were able to develop a certain type of system to keep certain things on the lock. But there are some serious legends in China of some serious stuff going on. I think even in Confucius Analects, he talks about it. And then now that I'm thinking about it, I know that in Islam, there was a lot of Arabian grimoires during the medieval years that probably a lot of that stuff is probably like under wraps, I would imagine, just because the whole friction between the devout Muslim and the one who took it on as a political status but was still practicing witchcraft or alchemy in secret, you know? Yeah, so.
Right. Well, I mean, there's some other psychological zones. You have the psychological zone of immortality that humans wish upon, and that's why they create this entity as well. And then, the Sleeping Beauty story is also a story of rising from the dead.
Yes.
That was taught to us at a very young age. Since then.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, there was one thing that you mentioned about Frankenstein, but not in this uh, uh, broadcast, but I think in another time we were talking, how you mentioned how, if you could expand on that just a little bit, how Frankenstein or Dr. Frankenstein represented a new era since he was a scientist and not a supernatural creature. Do you remember that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to expand on that a little bit.
What about him being the doctor, or him naming his entity
Him being
after
a
him?
doctor and how that separated him, or even introduced a new era where most of the dark characters were supernatural creatures, right, or legendary creatures.
Oh,
So,
okay. I see
yeah,
what you're
yeah,
leaning
yeah.
on. Yeah. Okay. Well, during this time period, there was a lot of characters that embodied a lot of stories from the old time, and shall I say, put a cap on the bottle type of thing. It consolidated a lot of different stories inside of one. And that way, you didn't get the details of all the ghastly and ghoulish stuff that I put in my books. I went, and that's what Frankenstein is a composite of: the Blob, the Swamp Thing, Count Dracula, the werewolf. There's a couple of other ones too. The Addams family. They stuffed a lot of spiritual entities because you have to understand that there's some type of magic system with the atmosphere with words and how they're combined and aligned up, and they embody certain energies in certain spaces once these words are compiled, or once you use the right words or whatever. Fortunately, unfortunately, the stories inside my books do that, and it's very real. The undead energy is, you will feel it, as thorough as you feel the werewolf energy or the witch, inside.
Yeah, that stuff is very powerful. I can testify to that. Those
Yeah,
books are
yeah,
very powerful, So,
yeah.
I mean,
So,
going through that stuff is it's a pretty intense journey. You know what I'm saying? And I think the readers, the viewers, will definitely uh, find your work to be a true treasure chest. You
yeah,
there's
I
a
mean,
lot of
I'm gonna tell
information.
the people right now, I got my number out here. If the volume 2 gets too heavy for you, I'm out here for you to contact, and I'll massage your brain up a little bit because I notice a lot of people fall off after the. No, I might as well send a free nightlight this motherfucker, because I'm gonna tell you right now, like just like on volume 1, when I first released the book, I had a friend call me and was like, "Bro, this stuff is worse than a horror movie," and it is. A lot of the stuff that's up in here, books, are worse than horror movies.
Yeah, and the
I don't
imagery,
know.
you can really get a feel of the imagery. So, when I read it, it's definitely very cinematic because the words that are used. So it transports you through that time period. And to be honest with you, it's a good thing because a lot of times focus is placed on civilizations that are more ancient in some ways, and we forget about the intermediary funnel that those customs came through, which was the medieval. And so to see some of the horrors and some of the victories of what happened equally, because right now we always get like Lord of the Rings stories, but to really see what was going on at that time period, and just some of the dynamics that were happening, definitely reshapes the specter of possibilities that humanity is capable of and has enacted in their history. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's why, on a subconscious level, there were degrees of patriotism in America. Because some people, although they may try to hide it, they do remember some of those horror stories that was passed down through family line. You know what I'm saying? And you know, and for those who are not aware of it, we may think that the grass has been greener on the other side for years. You know what I'm saying? And not see the struggle that everyone's had to get to a place to begin a new struggle in the world. So I think on that, I'm going to close it down because next week we got an exciting episode where we're going to be talking about the vampire. That's going to be a sequel out of a sequel out of a sequel because vampire.
Yeah, the vampire. Well, you know, Batman is a vampire. And rest in
Yes.
peace to Chadwick Boseman. You know, I gotta say that real quick. Jackie
Yeah,
Robinson,
nothing rest in
you too,
peace,
all of
man.
that.
That was really-
But yeah, Batman is actually a vampire when you understand the man with the bat, and the vampire just turned to the bat. You know, so there's a lot of dynamics we'll be talking about with that. You know, but
I'm looking
yeah,
forward to it,
this
man. That's
is
gonna be
Undead.
good. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah. And you heard the case of the girl that just got found undead in the mortuary home, in the funeral home.
yeah,
They found her in the casket and she was still alive. So, you know, stay alive.
at least that's for the family. It's like, wow, you made it. That's a story. That is a story. Wow. All right, brother. This is Warlock Asylum with Keenan Booker, aka the God 720. We're gonna be out. We're gonna say peace, and we'll be back shortly with some more OG Dead.
Yeah.
Peace.